I had always wanted to live in a beautiful, peaceful neighborhood, the kind where the streets were clean, the houses were well kept, and everything looked picture perfect. So when I finally bought my dream home in a community managed by a homeowners association, I thought I had made a great decision. The house was spacious, with a nice yard, friendly neighbors, and plenty of potential to make it my own. But from the very first day, something felt off. The HOA, run by a guy named Mr. Thompson, seemed to have way too much control over everything. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just a way to keep the neighborhood looking nice. But then I started to notice the ridiculous rules. Trash bins had to be brought in within 30 minutes of collection, lawns couldn't be more than 3 inches high, and worst of all, exterior paint colors had to be pre-approved by the HOA board. That last rule was what started it all. My house, while structurally solid, had a peeling, outdated beige paint job that made it look like it hadn't been updated in decades. So I decided it was time for a fresh, modern change. I carefully picked a deep navy blue with crisp white trim, a classic and elegant color scheme that would make the house stand out in the best way possible. Excited, I submitted my color request to the HOA, thinking it was just a formality. A week later, I got a curt email from Mr. Thompson, denied. No explanation, just a rejection. I reached out to ask why, and he responded that my color choice didn't fit the aesthetic of the community. I was confused. Other houses in the neighborhood had similar, even bolder colors. So I dug deeper. After reviewing the HOA's bylaws, I found something interesting. The rules were vague, and while they recommended certain colors, they didn't explicitly ban others. It seemed that the HOA just liked picking and choosing their battles, and I had become their latest target. Determined not to be bullied, I decided to go ahead with the project anyway. I hired a professional crew, and within a few days, my home was transformed. The deep blue was striking, the white trim made the details pop, and for the first time, I felt like the house truly belonged to me. My neighbors even complimented the new look. But Mr. Thompson? He was furious. The day after the painters finished, I woke up to a loud knocking on my door. When I opened it, I was met with 2 uniformed police officers standing on my porch, and right behind them, with his arms crossed and a smug smirk on his face, was none other than Mr. Thompson. "Sir, we received a report of unauthorized property modification," one of the officers said, glancing at my freshly painted home. I was stunned. Calling the cops over a paint job? Was this guy serious? Trying to keep my cool, I asked what law I had supposedly broken. The officers hesitated, clearly realizing how ridiculous the situation was. They explained that Mr. Thompson had reported me for vandalizing property, claiming I was defacing the neighborhood. That's when I laughed. Vandalizing? This is my house. I paid for the paint, I paid for the work, and I'm the one who lives here. What law says I can't improve my own property? I asked. The officers exchanged glances. It was clear they didn't want to be there, and after a quick check of my home ownership records, they agreed that I hadn't done anything illegal. Before they left, one officer even turned to Mr. Thompson and warned him about wasting police resources for petty personal grievances. I thought that would be the end of it. I had proven that I wasn't breaking any laws, and the cops had basically told him to stop bothering them. But Mr. Thompson wasn't finished. If anything, he was angrier than before, and I had no idea that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Because what happened next? It would turn the entire HOA on its head. After the failed attempt to use the police against me, I thought Mr. Thompson would back off, but I couldn't have been more wrong. If anything, the embarrassment of the police siding with me only fueled his determination to make my life miserable. Over the next few weeks, I became public enemy number 1 in the HOA's eyes. It started with small, petty violations. One morning, I received a notice in my mailbox stating that my trash cans had been left out too long. The next day, I got another warning, this time for a patchy lawn, even though I had just mowed it the day before. It became clear that they weren't enforcing rules. They were targeting me. Then came the fines. First, a $50 fine for unauthorized modifications, then a $100 fine for disrupting neighborhood uniformity. When I refused to pay, they doubled them. Suddenly, my so-called violation fees totaled over $1,000. It was blatant harassment, and I wasn't the only one who saw it. My neighbors, who had initially been hesitant to get involved, started noticing the unfair treatment. A few of them even told me privately that they had received similar petty fines in the past but were too afraid to challenge the HOA. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me. This HOA had been bullying homeowners for years, and I was just their latest target. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I fought back. But instead of arguing with them directly, I started looking for weaknesses. I dug into the HOA's financial reports, their bylaws, and even past complaints. What I found was shocking. The HOA wasn't just strict, they were corrupt. They had been charging homeowners extra fees without explanation, and a significant portion of the HOA's budget, money that was supposed to be used for community upkeep, had been mysteriously unaccounted for. Even worse, it seemed that Mr. Thompson had a history of shady dealings, quietly pressuring homeowners into compliance while funneling HOA funds into consulting fees that conveniently ended up in an account linked to him. Armed with this information, I decided to hit them where it hurt. First, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, demanding transparency and a detailed audit of all funds. Of course, Mr. Thompson and his inner circle refused, claiming they didn't owe explanations to homeowners. That's when I took it to the next level. I got the community involved. I went door to door, talking to my neighbors, showing them the financial discrepancies and the bogus fines. I even created a social media group where people could share their own horror stories about the HOA's harassment. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. Homeowners who had been silently suffering under Mr. Thompson's rule finally started to speak up. But Mr. Thompson wasn't going down without a fight. Seeing that I had rallied the neighborhood against him, he pulled out his biggest threat yet: foreclosure. He claimed that my unpaid fines gave the HOA the legal right to put a lien on my house, and if I didn't pay, they could eventually foreclose on it. This was his final move, his way of scaring me into submission. What he didn't realize was that I had anticipated this. What happened next? It would change everything. Because I wasn't just going to win this fight, I was about to take over the entire HOA. Thompson thought he had backed me into a corner with his foreclosure threat. But what he didn't realize was that he had just made a critical mistake. I had already done my research on how HOAs worked, and I knew something he didn't. An HOA can't just foreclose on a home without going through a strict legal process, and I had the power to stop it. First, I lawyered up. I hired a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, and within a day he confirmed what I suspected. The fines they were issuing were completely bogus and unenforceable. HOA boards can issue fines, but they need to be based on actual bylaw violations, not personal vendettas. Plus, an HOA foreclosure requires months of legal processing, and if challenged properly, it could be blocked entirely. Mr. Thompson had no real power over me. He was bluffing, and now I had proof. But I didn't stop there. I wanted to dismantle his entire operation. While digging through public records and HOA financial statements, I made another shocking discovery. A large portion of the community's properties were actually owned by rental investors. HOAs operate on a voting system. Each homeowner gets a vote. But what most people don't realize is that large property owners, like landlords who own multiple homes, have multiple votes. If I could get the investors on my side, I wouldn't just be able to stop Mr. Thompson. I could take over the HOA itself. So I started making calls. I tracked down the biggest landlords in the community, reaching out to them one by one. I explained how the HOA's corruption was driving down property values and making it harder for them to rent out their homes. I even provided evidence of misused funds and unfair rule enforcement. The response? They were furious. These investors didn't care about the HOA politics, but they cared a lot about their bottom line. If the HOA was hurting their profits, they were ready to do something about it. That's when I proposed a plan. We were going to hold a special vote to remove Mr. Thompson and his board from power. According to the HOA bylaws, if enough homeowners demanded a vote, we could force a recall election and replace the entire leadership. Normally, this would be difficult. Most homeowners are too busy or uninterested to get involved. But with the investors on my side, I had enough votes to outnumber Mr. Thompson's supporters. The night of the meeting, the HOA board was completely blindsided. Mr. Thompson strutted in, assuming this was just another routine gathering where he could intimidate people into silence. But the moment the recall vote was announced, his face drained of color. One by one, homeowners and investors stood up, listing the complaints against him: financial mismanagement, harassment, abuse of power. When the votes were tallied, it wasn't even close, Mr. Thompson was officially removed as HOA president. But here's the best part. Since I had been the one to organize everything, the homeowners voted me in as the new HOA president. Mr. Thompson had spent months trying to bully me out of my own home, and now I owned the very organization he had used against me. The power shift was complete, but I wasn't done yet. It was time to clean house and make sure no one in this neighborhood was ever bullied again. Becoming the HOA president wasn't just about revenge. It was about fixing the mess Mr. Thompson had created. I wasn't interested in running the HOA just for power. I wanted to make real changes that would benefit the entire community. But first, I had to deal with the damage left behind. The first thing I did was open the books. With the help of a few newly elected board members, people who had suffered under Mr. Thompson just like I had, I brought in an independent auditor to go through every financial record the HOA had. What we found was even worse than I imagined. Mr. Thompson had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including travel, entertainment, and even paying himself consulting fees for work that didn't exist. Thousands of dollars that should have gone to maintaining the neighborhood had been funneled into his personal accounts. Worse yet, he had been using legal loopholes to overcharge homeowners for arbitrary fines, pocketing a percentage of the penalties through shady third-party contracts. I wasted no time. We reported everything. The evidence was handed over to the local authorities, and within weeks, Mr. Thompson was facing a full-scale fraud investigation. When homeowners found out what he had done, their frustration turned to full-blown outrage. The very people who had once been afraid of speaking out were now demanding justice. Some residents even filed civil suits against him to recover the money they had been unfairly fined over the years. His reign of terror was officially over. With Thompson gone, it was time to rebuild trust in the HOA. I knew that most people hated HOAs because of power-hungry leaders like him, but I also knew that a properly run HOA could actually improve the neighborhood. So, I did what no HOA president ever does. I gave power back to the homeowners. First, we revised the bylaws to make sure no president could ever abuse their authority again. We set limits on fines, added financial transparency rules, and required community votes on major decisions. No more secret board meetings, no more arbitrary punishments. Every decision now had to go through the homeowners. Second, I cut unnecessary fees. Under Thompson, people had been paying inflated HOA dues without seeing any real improvements. I renegotiated contracts with landscapers, maintenance crews, and other service providers to make sure homeowners were getting the best value for their money. Within months, we had a surplus of funds, money that we used to improve shared spaces, repave roads, and even lower HOA fees for everyone. Third, I created a community watchdog group. This gave homeowners a direct way to report any suspicious behavior or concerns about how the HOA was being run. Instead of fearing the HOA, people now had a say in how things were handled. No more unchecked power, just a group of neighbors working together to make the community better. Slowly but surely, things started to change. The same HOA that had once been a nightmare for homeowners was now working in their favor. People weren't afraid to speak up anymore. The ridiculous fines and petty harassment stopped. And the best part? Home values in the neighborhood actually went up. It turns out that when people aren't being bullied by their HOA, they actually take more pride in their homes. But there was one last thing I had to do to truly put an end to Mr. Thompson's legacy. While cleaning up old records, I discovered something shocking. The HOA actually owned the land under his house. It was a technicality buried in the original property deeds, but it meant one thing. He was renting from the very HOA he used to run. And now, I was his landlord. What happened next? It was the perfect ending to this entire battle. After months of fighting back, removing Mr. Thompson from power, and repairing the damage he had inflicted on the community, I finally felt a sense of peace. The HOA was fair again. Homeowners had regained control, and people were no longer living in fear of arbitrary fines or legal threats. I had done what I set out to do, restoring order and putting an end to the corruption that had plagued the neighborhood for so long. But just when I thought the battle was over, a final discovery changed everything. While reviewing the last set of HOA property records, I stumbled upon something that made me stop in my tracks. As it turned out, the HOA actually owned a small section of land under Mr. Thompson's house. It was an obscure legal technicality from when the neighborhood was first developed. While he owned the building itself, the land beneath it was part of a land lease agreement, one that required annual renewal under the HOA's jurisdiction. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't have been a big deal. Most land leases last for decades without issue. But with the new HOA leadership in place, the responsibility of approving that lease renewal now fell to me. For a moment, I sat there in disbelief. The man who had spent years terrorizing homeowners, issuing fines for the pettiest infractions, and even trying to force me out of my own house was living on land owned by the very HOA he had once ruled. And now, after all his abuse of power, I held his fate in my hands. Without hesitation, I called an emergency board meeting and laid out the situation. Everyone listened intently as I explained what I had found, and together, we considered our next course of action. There were two possible outcomes. We could renew his land lease at the current rate, allowing him to remain in the home as before. Or we could adjust the lease to fair market value, a price he had conveniently avoided paying for years while controlling the HOA finances to his advantage. I wasn't interested in being as petty or vindictive as he had been. I wanted to follow the law, making the same decision that any reasonable landlord would. I proposed that we charge him a fair market rate for the land, and the board unanimously agreed. A formal notice was sent to Mr. Thompson, informing him that his lease had been adjusted to match current property values. The result? The new amount was 3 times what he had been paying before. I already knew what was going to happen next. There was no way he could afford the new rate. Without his stolen HOA funds and the backdoor financial schemes he had used for years, he was just another homeowner with a mortgage. Within weeks, he began missing payments. When he failed to catch up, the eviction process started. The very legal loopholes he had once used to threaten homeowners with foreclosure had now turned against him. The day he was officially forced out was one I will never forget. He tried everything to fight it, hiring a lawyer in a last-ditch attempt to challenge the decision, but it was useless. With a pending financial fraud case still looming over him and every legal document in the HOA's favor, he had no ground to stand on. It was over. The man who once controlled every aspect of the neighborhood, who had wielded his authority like a weapon and called the cops on me over paint, was now being evicted from the very HOA he had once ruled. But the final blow was yet to come. His house was put up for sale, and according to HOA policy, the association itself had first rights to purchase it. And who was in charge of that decision? Me. I didn't even want to live in that house, but the satisfaction of knowing he had lost everything was too good to pass up. With the support of a few neighbors, I made the purchase, not to move in, but to ensure that he would never set foot in this neighborhood again. And just like that, the nightmare was over. The once feared HOA tyrant was gone for good. The community had been restored, and homeowners no longer had to live under the shadow of intimidation and corruption. The power had finally been returned to the people. Looking back, I never imagined that painting my house would set off a chain of events that would lead me here. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Bullies only win when people let them. I stood up, I fought back, and in the end, justice was served.